Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming out on this beautiful Saturday afternoon in the town of Hingham. I'd like to welcome all of you for coming. As we continue our conversation with the town of Hingham relative to the acquisition of the water company. To my right are my colleagues, Ms. Mary Power, Ms. Karen Johnson, Attorney Kerry Ryan, Mr. John Ashard. Down in the front row joining us is Andrew Gottlieb. Some of you have seen the Tuesday night meeting where Andrew gave a fulsome explanation of some of the issues of concern. We're continuing to have the conversation with the town of Hingham. This is going to be recorded, so those that can't make it can watch it at their leisure, hopefully prior to town meeting, which is April 22nd. At this point in time, we're going to start out in a similar way that we did before. Mary will lead, Karen will follow up. I'll wrap. We'll take questions from the audience to those that wish to pose any. And when that time comes, I just ask you to raise your hand. Our Assistant Town Administrator, Michelle Monsegur, will come over with the microphone, address your question to the podium, and we'll take it from there. So with that having been said, we'll get right to it. I want to thank you all for coming today.
I've already done it. We're good.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for being here today. What I'd like to do is just give a little bit of an overview of some of what's brought us here today, and really to sort of start out with a summary of why the Board of Selectmen unanimously recommends favorable action and that the town purchase the water company. And while there are many reasons, the reasons that are up on the slide stand out the most to us. First and foremost, purchasing the water company allows us the ability to manage the delivery system of a very critical resource. Secondly, it eliminates the shareholder, making ratepayers the first and only priority. We'll talk about the financial benefit of that, but also the benefit in terms of stewardship of the water system and the water supply. Third, it provides a greater ability to protect the watershed. Fourth, it makes fiscal sense now and even greater fiscal sense in the future. It allows for greater financial and operational transparency. And also, just as a note, it doesn't raise our taxes. It doesn't compete with funding, with capital funding for other projects that the town may consider. Just as background, our water company was actually incorporated in 1879 by a group of 12 Hingham residents, including names such as Governor Long, Barnes, Shute. Many of the very prominent names in Hingham's history founded our water company. And that was done through a special act that was approved by the Massachusetts General Court, which is also known as the legislature. This was a very common practice at that time, and all of the special acts that allowed water companies to be founded contained one important right. And that right was that at any time, the residents of the community could vote to purchase the water company back. That was not unique to our statute. That was the same with all the companies being formed at the time. And it's our theory that the legislature at that time recognized that water being such a critical municipal resource, that it was important to protect the legal rights of citizens going into the future. Our water company has always been privately owned. For many years, it was owned by, it was called the Hingham Water Company. It was part of American Water. And you know what many people would say is they characterized it as being very much feeling like a locally owned and operated water company. But that actually began to change in 2002. In 2002, our water company became part of what is now known today as the Aquarian Water Company, and it was owned by a British company called Kelda. 5 years later, in 2007, Kelda sold the water system to an Australian company named Macquarie. And what we began to notice as a town is that with that shift in ownership, we saw some things happening that were very different and cause of great concern to the Board of Selectmen at the time. Overall, there was a dissatisfaction with the management and the maintenance of our water system. Despite having the 5th highest water rates in the state, there was what we refer to as a break-and-fix water main strategy. So we have, just as background, about 190 miles of water mains in our service area. And the average life of a water main is about 70 years. And the average age of the water mains in our system is about 64 years. So, just like with our houses, you gotta kind of take care of your assets. And what we were seeing is that despite paying the 5th highest rates in the state, that money wasn't being reinvested back into the system. And actually, the picture you see on the slide was from 2012. Many of you may remember that in 2011, the water main on Union Street broke 5 times. And when it broke the 6th time, the Board of Selectmen at the time met in a public meeting and asked Aquarian, is this water main going to be fixed? And they said, well, it's not going to get fixed for another year because it's going to cost $1 million to fix and we don't have it. And when members of the board asked what the system was for funding capital projects, the first thing that Aquarian said was, well, that's a big function of our shareholder returns, and then ratepayer appetites for rate increases. And there was something that was a little bit unsettling about that. I think we also at the time had concerns about our stressed watershed. In 2012, the unaccounted for water, which is the water that is withdrawn from the aquifer, treated in the plant, but doesn't make its way into our households, was 24% against a Massachusetts standard of 10%. There was also a lack of coordination with the town's road building program. The town was also recognizing that in this dynamic where our small local water company was now part of a bigger conglomerate, there was this inherent conflict that was coming up many times between the shareholders and the ratepayers. That conflict hadn't existed to that degree before. And we were also very concerned about ownership changes. Again, between 2012, 2007, and 2017, our water system has been owned by 3 different companies within the last 15 years. The Board of Selectmen initiated a warrant article that town meeting authorized to begin a feasibility study to explore whether it was a good idea for Hingham to purchase its water system. I'm going to highlight some of the things that we learned over 7 years of study. One of the first things that we learned is that our ownership circumstance was actually a little bit unusual. We learned that over 96% of Massachusetts water systems are run by public agencies. That's either run by a municipality, it may be run by a water district, it may be run by the Massachusetts Water Resource Authority, or MWRA. And if you drill further down into Massachusetts and you look at water companies of our size, which is actually determined based on the number of customers, we are what's called a medium-sized water company. There are 41 of those in the entire state, and we are the only one that is privately owned. We also were able to get some data that confirmed our concern that our water system hadn't been sufficiently maintained. What you see on the slide up on the screen is a chart that goes from 2005 to 2017. And those blue bars represent the number of feet of water mains that were replaced in any given year. So for example, if you look at the third bar from the left-hand side of the screen, that's 2007, there wasn't a single water main replaced in 2007. And the legend on the slide, for folks who can't read it, it's in increments of 1,000. So if you look, for example, in the first 6 years on the screen, which is 2005 to 2010, in each of those years, less than 1,000 feet of water mains were replaced out of a system of 190 miles. The red line that you see on the top of the screen is actually the recommended annual number of feet of water mains that are recommended for replacement by a study that Aquarian actually commissioned itself. And what we're able to see is that in that 13-year period, Aquarian has replaced less than 1/3 of the water mains that its own study is recommending. This is one of the very compelling reasons that caused the town to both initiate the study and that is one of the reasons why we are recommending the purchase. We also found that the lack of water main replacement resulted in a lack of coordination with our road building program, and that was actually having an impact on us as taxpayers as well. You know, many of you are aware that in the last, since 2011, the town has had a road building program where, as of this year, we've probably improved close to 50% of the roads in Hingham. This is a really concerted effort where we get some money from the state. We use some of our taxpayer dollars. And what the town tries to do is to coordinate that work with the utilities so that we're not opening up roads multiple times. Because once a road is opened up, its quality is compromised. And what we've actually found is that we've had great cooperation with National Grid. As the town looks at its road building schedule, we sit down with the utilities and say, here's what we'd like to do, and we try to best coordinate where we can. And the town is also flexible, so if a utility says, we can't do that in 2014, could you move it to 2015? You know, we do try to be flexible and to accommodate. But when you have investment levels that are less than 2,000 feet of water mains a year, it's really difficult. And what we've actually found is, you know, many of you may be aware that we have a 5-year moratorium on a road. Once a road is repaved, it can't be opened up for 5 years because, again, we want to maintain the quality. But when there's an emergency water repair, you have to open the road. You're left with no choice. Out of the 110 roads that we've repaved, resurfaced since 2011, 22% of them have had to be opened up for emergency repairs. And while you can't necessarily always predict when a water main will break, we actually took a look at the Aquarian capital plans for 2007, 2011, and 2014. And we would continue to see many of the streets listed that we were repaving as part of our road building program. And, you know, the picture on the screen you see, that's Merrill Street. Merrill Street had, I think it was 5 water main breaks over a short period of time. And when the town went to repave Merrill Street, it was 630 feet to repave it. Aquarian decided not to replace the water main, and less than 2 years later, there was a water main break, and now look what that beautiful street looks like. This is happening to streets all over Hingham, and what it caused us to realize is that we're all paying for streets to be opened and repaired, and that lack of coordination is really, it's not in the town's best interest. We also learned that, you know, with respect to regulation, because, you know, water quality is something that it's important to all of us. And what we also learned, and as Paul said, Mr. Gottlieb is here to answer questions, but the Department of Environmental Protection that regulates the water supply, they actually own the water supply in the state, and they have regulations that have to do with everything from how much water we can withdraw from the aquifer to who is eligible to run water systems and do the very important work that goes on to get water to our homes. And the role of the DPU doesn't change with an ownership change. So we will have the same operating standards, the same certification requirements, the same quality and monitoring that takes place today. We learned that whether a company is private or public, all the costs of running that utility belong to us ratepayers. We learned that under municipal ownership, there are a number of costs that go away. And earlier I said that this makes financial sense. And our water company acquisition study committee, made up of 4 former chairs of the advisory committee and the commissioner of the chair of the sewer commission, spent a lot of time looking at the financial impact of this. And what they determined after a year of study is that under municipal ownership, there are some costs that go away. That includes federal and state taxes, profit, and rate filing costs. And I would also add that the town's financial analysis was also confirmed with 2 external firms that the town had never done business with. They concurred with the conclusions of the Water Company Acquisition Study Committee. And in fact, when the advisory committee heard these warrant articles, before voting 11-2 in favor of supporting purchase, they also confirmed that the financial savings were significant. Another reason that the financial savings are significant is because municipalities have lower borrowing costs than a corporation. And here in Hingham, we're just so fortunate that we have that AAA bond rating from all three rating agencies, which is a reflection of the soundness of our management. What that means is that we can actually borrow money for 2 percentage points or 200 basis points for the finance people in the room, lower than Aquarian. So if you think about a water main replacement project of, say, $1 million, the town can borrow that money at 3%, but a private owner is going to be at least 2 percentage points higher. We learned that water companies are really profitable, and I think for us it helped answer the question of why we are seeing such an intense effort by the current owners of the water company to maintain the ownership structure. The Department of Public Utilities regulates rates for privately owned utilities. And with privately owned water systems in Massachusetts, there are really only a handful of them. But they set rates that allow the utility owner to earn a profit. Nothing wrong with that. The typical kind of return on equity is about 10.5%. And in fact, the most recent rate case authorized a 10.5% return. But there's something else that we learned, and if you're curious about this, Mr. Asher can explain it far better than I can, but one of the things that we learned that was kind of unusual is that the water treatment plant that's down off of Main Street is actually owned by a separate subsidiary of Aquarian called Aquarian Capital. So Aquarian Capital owns our water treatment plant, and they lease it to the Aquarian Water Company. And they get a 15% profit. Aquarian Capital gets a 15% profit by leasing it to Aquarian Water Company, who then bills us for that. And what was also noteworthy to us is that while Aquarian Water Company is regulated by the Department of Public Utilities, Aquarian Capital is not. And just to put this in perspective for you, in this year, in the most recent rate case, Aquarian collects about $13 million from all of its ratepayers in Hingham, Hull, and North Cohasset. They collect just over $13 million. The profit that's referenced on that slide on the screen is $2.4 million. So $2.4 million of the $13 million that we're paying today is profit to shareholders and profit that one Aquarian subsidiary realizes from another. So as we talk about being able to eliminate cost and run the water system at a lower cost, it's eliminating costs like this that make this financially feasible. And these are costs that are being eliminated that aren't going to affect the treatment of the water, the operation of the system. We learned that municipally owned water companies are generally funded through an enterprise fund. Again, we can get into this in detail if people are interested, but Article 11 at this year's town meeting asks if you would be willing to establish, or I think it's 12, Article 12, if you would be willing to establish an enterprise fund. And what this allows us to do is it allows us to separate water company revenue and expenses from everything else. And we've talked about the fact that town ownership of the water company will not affect taxes. The enterprise fund is a way to segregate and keep the water company separate. And that's a common practice that's done across Massachusetts. We also learned that municipal ownership costs are the highest in the first 30 years, and then they drop. And really, this is kind of like what happens at our houses, which is that in 30 years, the mortgage is paid off. In the first 30 years of town ownership, our water rates would pay for all the necessary work to deliver water to our households, plus the principal and interest on the purchase price. It would be making the mortgage payment. And in fact, after 30 years, one of the members of the advisory committee had looked at our analysis and said, in year 31, when the mortgage is paid off, about 36% of the costs to the town go away because that mortgage is paid off. So, the way we kind of think of it is, right now, we're renters. Right now, our water bills are like paying rent. Under town ownership, we can reduce your rent payment, and in 30 years, we're going to own it. We're going to own the asset. And this is a visual depiction of that. Again, according to our analysis, validated by an expert, endorsed by the advisory committee, in the first 30 years the average savings are about $1.5 million a year. In year 30, after that mortgage is paid off, they jump to over $7 million a year. And we've had a lot of questions about, so what does this mean for my water rates? And how's this gonna work? And what we would say is that two things are gonna happen. First of all, as you look forward, we're gonna have lower and slower rate increases. We won't have shareholder needs to satisfy. We won't have some other costs. So the future rate increases will be lower and slower. I think what's also more significant is that some of those savings mean that we have additional money to put into the system. Right now, the town's financial analysis includes $2.7 million each year for capital. But again, if we have some of those savings, we might be able to accelerate capital improvements even more. Again, I've mentioned this, but your taxes aren't going to go up as a result of buying the water company. And we do have a lot of capital needs in this town. We're sitting in this beautiful middle school. 5 years ago, my oldest son was in the former Hingham Middle School that was on this site. And here is this big, beautiful building that is indicative of the kind of support that the community has given to capital projects. And we have some additional work to do on that. Since 1998, we've invested a great deal of money into improving many of our schools, but we know that we have one school remaining, and that's Foster School. We know that we have other capital needs in the town, and again, because this is separate in an enterprise fund, it's not going to compete with that, with any of that funding. The other thing that we did, because we understand our AAA bond rating is really important to the town, is that we asked our financial advisors and the credit rating agencies what would be the impact of the town purchasing the water company. And what we were told is that, first of all, because the water company revenue would pay all the costs of operating the water company, the purchase of the water company, which is going to be about $108 million, won't count against our debt limit. So again, we won't have an issue with debt limit. And the second thing that the rating agencies told us was, everything else being equal, because the revenue of the water company can support the debt payments, they don't see the purchase of the water company on its own having any impact on our AAA bond rating. And again, something that was very important to the town. So as I just mentioned, the purchase price is approximately $108 million. And what's important to know is that this purchase price formula that was decided by the court means that the price goes up by about $3 to $4 million a year. So for example, if we defer this decision for 5 years, the cost could be $15 to $20 million higher. And I think that's really important. We've been really carefully studying this for 7 years. And, I think we've heard some say, should we look at this more? Should we study it more? We need to keep in mind that the purchase price is going to increase as time goes on. I won't read the quote that's on the screen, but again, these are quotes from the town's financial advisors, because again, an important part of our due diligence was understanding how this might affect town finances. Just two other things. It's been really unusual to me, but since Hingham began the feasibility study in 2012, OBrien has spent $2.7 million on public relations activities. And what you see there are copies of 2 invoices that come from the Department of Public Utilities in the last rate case. These are documents that are available to the public in the DPU file room, case number 1790. And while these costs were not part of the rate case, they were required to be disclosed as part of the rate case. And I have a couple binders at home. I think I've got 3 inches of binders with copies of a couple hundred pages of receipts that look like that. And, some of the PR activity you might expect from a water company around community relations, partnering with the Weir River watershed. But from our look at it, the majority of these costs had to do with items associated with what's characterized as the Hingham takeover. So it's things like opposition research on Hingham Municipal Light Plant employees, a political analysis of the advisory committee, a shift of the Aquarian website from being informational to campaign mode. We see numerous expenses of things associated with filing an open meeting law complaint against the Board of Selectmen, calls to senior citizens encouraging them to write letters to the Advisory Committee and Board of Selectmen advising against a purchase. There was one listing that said, worked with Hingham Journal to kill a story on the sale of Aquarian from Macquarie. These are not normal, typical PR expenditures. Normal PR expenditures are doing a better job at communicating when a water main is broken, doing a better job communicating when hydrant flushing is taking place, but the majority of these expenses had to do with trying to reach in and undermine our town government process. As a longstanding volunteer in this community and a former member of the advisory committee, this is very troubling to me. And I just want to make one other point, which is a little bit of an expense comparison, because there's a lot of numbers flying around out there. And what you see on the left-hand side, the town through June of this past year has spent just under $1.5 million on the feasibility study. And that's money that all of you have approved at town meeting, or that the advisory committee approved through a reserve fund transfer. So all of that money was authorized, the bulk of it again by town meeting. And what you'll see is the initial study the town undertook was about $100,000, and we had to enter into 4 years of litigation to determine the purchase price. And the litigation, the legal fees, the expert witness, the administrative, which is like getting transcripts, that was actually just under $1.4 million. And that was the cost. That was the cost for the town. Now, again, because Aquarian is a private company, we don't have access to a lot of information. We don't know how much Aquarian spent on the litigation. We don't know how much they spent on any kind of study. We know they've spent $2.7 million on public relations, and the town has spent $0. So, it's been suggested to me that the town has spent $1.5 million on feasibility, and Aquarian has spent $2.7 on public relations, and somehow those two things are equal. I think we need to look at the components of those expenses, because in my mind, they are not equal, they are not comparable, and I would also say that I don't think they're complete. My colleagues can tell you that for several years, it's not uncommon for us to be having a Board of Selectmen meeting when there are 5 or 6 paid attorneys and PR people from Aquarian in our rooms. So I just don't think that's really comparable. This has been a little bit of background on what has compelled the town to begin the study, some of the things that we found. An important part of the decision that we're asking all of you to make has to do with what you can expect in terms of how your water company will be operated, what role you will have in the rate-setting process, how this will be structured. So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Karen Johnson, to give you a look at what the Hingham Water Company would look like under town ownership.
They don't usually give me the clicker, so thanks, Mary. I'm going to back up to here before we start. First of all, thanks to all of you for being here. I think you get extra points given how beautiful it was when we walked in. And I don't know about you, but when my husband Jim and I were looking for a house in Hingham, we looked in the spring, and you get caught hook, line, and sinker, because this town gets more beautiful every day in the spring. And so this morning, as I was around town, you saw people, cleaning up their lawns, going for a run or walk. You come here and you see the kids outside enjoying the fields that this town supported building. And in all of this sort of hard work and at sometimes stressful environment, it's sort of nice to recall why we're all here. And we're here to do the business of the town in the best interest of the town. So I really appreciate you in particular taking the time today to be with us, to hear this story, and to be able to share that story with others and encourage them to attend town meeting on April 22nd. I'd also like to thank Harbor Media. Mary thanked you the other night, but I'm sure you didn't bargain for this year. You've done yeoman's work in setting up in various locations in order to bring this message to the town. I was doing the breakfast dishes this morning and was watching our last presentation, getting ready for this one. I feel like it's kind of like an athletic team watching film, right, before you get ready to go. So thank you to the other town volunteers. Thank you to the Water Study Committee and to my colleagues. It's been a long haul, but we've learned a lot. And I think that we, as you can see from Mary's earlier presentation, have taken very seriously our fiduciary obligation to evaluate this question and present it to town meeting in a way that we feel is responsible. So again, my thanks. So the reason I came back to this slide is, as Mary knows, and I'll save you the rant that I went on at the last water forum, but it to me is a demonstration and an inventory of some distressing behaviors. As Mary pointed out, when the legislature incorporated the franchise of the Hingham Water Company in 1879, it did so with an embedded right in the town to purchase the water, because water is an essential public good, right? And so while maybe we weren't ready as a municipality to step up and run pipes from a Cord Pond across town, and maybe most folks were on private wells at that point, I think the legislature's foresight in saying, someday you may want to make sure that this finite resource is being operated in the best interest of your municipality. We're going to put that in the special act that incorporates you and every other water franchise in the Commonwealth. And I appreciate that forethought. It's not unlike other states, particularly in New England, that I've evaluated. Sometimes it's embedded, the public right to control its water resources embedded in statute, and sometimes it's embedded in, for instance, in New Hampshire, there's a specific eminent domain proceeding that allows municipalities to essentially take back their water from for-profit entities. So this isn't a surprise, right? Our ability to call back our asset has been in the essentially the statutory contract since 1879. And so this comprehensive campaign that they have waged against the town's sort of methodical right to consider whether it makes sense to purchase its water company, I just find astounding. And as Mary said, not to make it all about us, but many of you in this room have led meetings in town hall, or you've come to meetings in town hall, and to go to your own meeting in town hall and feel like you're being cross-examined by a high-powered legal team, not only from Massachusetts, but now from Tennessee, is again just really unnerving. And so you have to ask yourself, why? Why, if I knew I bought something that you had the right to buy back, why am I fighting so hard to not consummate the transaction that I agreed to when I purchased this thing, right? And so, I guess one thing I would point out is, during the litigation, OBrien valued the water system at $192 million. And valued in that $192 million number, valued the water treatment plant at about $65 million. The court had to interpret a purchase price formula that was written in 1879, so you have to bear with the court a little bit there. But the end result was a purchase price to the town of $88 million. So if you are Aquarian and you think that your asset's worth $192 million and now you have to sell for 88, maybe that explains some of this. It doesn't make it right, but I think it might explain it. So now I'll move on with the remarks I'm supposed to give. Okay, so as Mary said, the financial folks were doing their thing. They kept me out of those discussions. But the next question up was, can the town of Hingham run the water company? Should the town of Hingham run the water company? And if so, how would we do that? So if town meeting votes to purchase the water company on April 22nd, we would enter a period of transition. And in order to prepare for that period of transition, we've done a number of things. So we have had ongoing conversations with the leadership at the Department of Environmental Protection, which, as Mary explained to you, regulates both the Water Management Act, the withdrawal right piece of running a water system, as well as the Safe Water Drinking Act aspect of running the system. So we met with them on several occasions sort of early on in the process. And I worked as part of the governance group with Charlie Cristello, our former town administrator, and Josh Krumholtz, who's a member of the Water Acquisition Study Committee and a lawyer in Boston. So the three of us sat together to distill the aspects of governance and transition that were relevant to the Hingham water system. We spoke with other communities and other water superintendents about how municipalities run their water. As Mary's slide showed you, most everybody in Massachusetts participates in a public water system. Hingham is an outlier here in having a for-profit entity run its water. I think the next thing that we did, and not necessarily on a straight timeline, but the next thing we did was think about what other expertise we needed to bring to the table in order to successfully manage the transition of the water operation. And so I said this the other day, I think we're really good in Hingham in terms of identifying volunteers with specialized skill sets that can help us evaluate the many complex questions that come before this town, right? There's, building buildings, there's our governance, and now there is the purchase of our water system. And we rally the troops, and we have significant resumes, I think, in the volunteer ranks that bring their time and energy to these tasks. But at some point, you actually need to hire professionals, and that's what we've done in hiring Bob Gollage and Andy Gottlieb, both former employees of the Department of Environmental Protection. Bob is a former DEP commissioner, to help us work, particularly on the regulatory side, in making sure that the transition runs smoothly and that the operation that would be run by Hingham comports in all manners with the regulatory requirements of running a public drinking water system. We created a water superintendent job description. So as you'll see a little bit later in the slide presentation, Hingham's going to actually have sort of two levels of expertise in running their public water. We will have an employee on the town books, on the town team, who will be our expert in water operations, and then the town will submit an RFP to contract with an outside water operator. The water superintendent's primary obligation will be to supervise that water company operator. We have requested a roll forward purchase price from OBrien to the date of town meeting. And importantly, we've coordinated the financial transactions with our financial advisor, town bond counsel, and the town finance team. So what happens if we vote yes? As I've indicated, we would issue a request for proposal for the water system operator. We have several models of that, and we are taking the best pieces of those RFPs to construct our own. Part of it will be the need to be familiar with a water treatment plant like ours that treats water not only from groundwaters but wells, and be able to work on a transition of the water system from a for-profit entity to the town. We'd hire a water superintendent. We'd issue bond documents. So you have to provide an offering statement. We're working with our longtime bond counsel, Rick Manley, on that aspect of the transaction. And importantly for you all, we'll establish two committees, one with the moderator, which will be the transition and evaluation team. Those folks I would expect to have a skill set that would range from finance to management to water operations, and they would be appointed by the Board of Selectmen and also by the moderator. And then there will be a citizens advisory board that will work with the water superintendent on rate setting and customer concerns, and that board will include representatives from Hingham, Hull, and Cohasset. During this period of time, so if town meeting votes to purchase, OBrien has a legal obligation under Massachusetts law to run the system as a going concern. You got to keep the lights on and you got to keep the water coming. You have a good husbandry obligation to operate the system. OBrien does. And then the town, importantly, will work with the Department of Environmental Protection to finalize the regulatory transition, which will include the transfer of the water registration rights. So what does our day one structure look like? So I probably should have inserted my old slide, which showed the structure under Aquarian, because it showed the shareholders at the top, then it showed Eversource, then it showed Aquarian, and Aquarian as the operating company. And my point in my earlier presentations was, as Mary pointed out, there are a lot of costs associated with that structure at the very top of the pyramid that have nothing to do with the provision of water at the bottom of the chain. That structure goes away under town ownership. I think the couple important things here, we've talked about the transition committee, the citizens advisory board. The water superintendent, you'll see, is right in the middle of the chain of command here. And the water superintendent will inform both the town administrator and the Hingham Board of Selectmen with respect to the water operator. The water operator will work with particular capital vendors to address the capital needs of the system. There are a number of operating vendors that work in the Southeast region of the DEP. Includes Suez, Whitewater, Veolia, Woodard and Curran, and Weston and Sampson. So we have been told by the DEP on more than one occasion that this is a very attractive system to run. And so we would anticipate getting multiple bids after town meeting to our RFP. And then I guess one last thing I'll say at the bottom is we would intend to enter into or memorialize a memorandum of understanding with Hull and Cohasset with respect to the operation of the system. As Paul, I think, pointed out, or Mary, we met with the Hingham Board of Selectmen a week or so ago to the full support of the entire board. They have a 5-member Board of Selectmen and a town manager, and to a person they were in support, and the audience was in full support. We heard stories from the folks in Hull, like you heard earlier today from Mary, about water main breaks and road repairs. So we would expect, in particular, to work cooperatively with Hull. They have just adopted a coordinated road replacement system. So we would like to work with them, just like we would work here in Hingham, to make sure that we're coordinating our efforts with respect to road openings. So a few words about water commissioners, because sometimes, when I'm around town and Fruit Center in particular, people are like, what's this with the Board of Selectmen being the water commissioners? So, when the governance group took a look at this, we came into evaluating what's best for the water system with an open mind. Who should undertake this role? And so we looked at, as Mary mentioned, there are 351 cities and towns in the Commonwealth. We focused in on 41 medium-sized water systems, because that's what Hingham is. And in that cohort, every municipality runs its water but us. There are 2 water districts on the Cape, but other than that, everybody runs their water through their Department of Public Works. And in every case, it's either the mayor or the Board of Selectmen that are the policy makers for the water system. So that's what the water commissioners do. They're the policy setting board. They're much like our elected sewer commission, or probably like our elected light plant board. They're not turning on lights. They're not operating sewer pipes. They're not mixing chemicals. They're setting policy and making sure that the technical people do the job that they're supposed to do. So the next question was, well, if everybody runs their water through their Department of Public Works and their executive branch of government is the water commissioners, is there anything special about those particular municipalities that would make it different for Hingham? And I don't think so, right? I look at the list and I think, if these folks can do it, Hingham can do it. And so I sort of gave you some representative towns. If you're interested in learning more about water systems, John Asher's mentioned this from time to time, Ty and Bond, which is a water engineering firm, has a dashboard out there where you can actually look up particular water systems and see how big they are and how they're organized. And as I said again, as water commissioners, the Board of Selectmen would be the policy makers. But we'd have 2 levels of technical expertise here in Hingham, the water superintendent and the water operating company. So, okay, now we're coming to your job. So at town meeting, there are going to be 4 related warrant articles. The big one is Article 10, and that's going to ask you to approve the purchase of the water company. And importantly, that requires a two-thirds vote in order to pass. And you all in this room know better than I do, that's a high bar. And so I think the message from here on out is people need to show up and stand up and be heard on the purchase of this finite asset. I don't know whether you all were around several years ago, but I was new to the advisory committee, and we had an opportunity to buy the Lincoln School Apartments, which is affordable senior housing right in the square. And in order to make sure that we could maintain that as affordable senior housing, we felt strongly that that ought to reside with municipal ownership, similar in some ways to what we're proposing to you now. There's a property manager, professional property manager that runs the building, and then there's a board of overseers that are town volunteers that make sure that the building is operating. And I see Al Chambers here, who lives at the Lincoln School. It's a fantastic place to live, and we've preserved that opportunity for seniors here in Hingham. That passed by 4 votes. We needed 2/3. That passed by 4 votes. So for those 4 people, if you didn't show up, we wouldn't have been able to provide that service to our seniors. So that's the importance of making sure that you're in the building on April 22nd. Article 11 authorizes the Board of Selectmen to act as water commissioners. Mary talked to you about the enterprise fund. And then Article 13 authorizes transition costs. That's because there's going to be a period of time between town meeting and the issuance of debt associated with the acquisition of the water company, and there'll be transition costs that need to be paid for. Those costs will be reimbursed by the borrowing and the water enterprise fund. There's a lot of information out there, and I think, despite the fact that we're a small but hearty crowd here today, I think people's attention is turning to town meeting. Pretty soon you're going to be getting this beautiful green warrant in the mail. I don't know about you. I'm always excited when my warrant comes, maybe too much so. But so now's the time to educate yourself, and you're doing that today. There's a whole host of other ways to inform yourself about all of the countless hours that volunteers have undertaken to present this question at town meeting. And so to have the confidence to stand up and vote yes, I think there are several ways to inform yourself that we've done our homework on this. And you know what? We wouldn't recommend it to you otherwise. So there's all kinds of information on our website. And again, I would shout out to Harbor Media. There are a number of televised meetings. If you have to pick a couple, I would say the last couple of advisory committee meetings were just really, really well done, thorough dialogue, a number of different points of view expressed, and I would commend that to your viewing pleasure. Maybe a little popcorn. We can do better, and we have to do better. I feel like we're at a really critical juncture for our watershed in particular. And Mary talked earlier about our ability to have a more coordinated effort to take care of our system, which I think is critical to our ability to protect our watershed and our water supply. So that's acquisition of recharge land. That's taking care of Fulling Mill Pond and Accord Pond, which are right now assets of Aquarian. And I think if we don't engage in accelerated infrastructure and capital improvement to our system now, our distressed watershed is only going to become more so. And that's just, as stewards of this town, that's just not right. We will manage the business with greater transparency. The budgeting process and rate setting process, the deliberations of the water commissioners, all of that stuff takes place at town hall. That's all has to be all out in the open. Every single piece of paper we touch is a public record. So right now there are, the opaqueness is probably generous. The lack of visibility, the lack of line of sight to the priorities and the operations of Aquarian, you can't get your arms around what they may or may not do. That's different in a municipally owned system. I think the other thing is, I drink the water. Paul drinks the water. Mary drinks the water. we have a very personal investment that this work seamlessly for everyone and remains affordable for everyone. We have a plan in place to fix the mains faster. As Mary said, the amount and frequency of the water rates will be lower and slower. And the reason for that is there's no profit element in this picture. The only cost is the cost of operation. And so in year one, we would intend to undertake a cost assessment of the system to determine just how much it costs us to operate it as a municipality, and rates would flow from that analysis. We've got the ability to improve coordination with other departments. I see Kirk Schultz here, the Water Supply Committee, the Department of Health, our DPW. We have a number of tools in our toolbox that we haven't been able to bring to the table to coordinate with the operation of the water company. And I think that that's something that we haven't even begun to explore, the kind of synergies that municipal ownership may afford us. And then, last but not least, as the statute provides, we have only one loyalty here, and that's to the ratepayers of the system. And I think that is a powerful lens with which to view all of the information that's coming at you. We have no secrets in this process, only you. And lastly, I'll say, sometimes it's important to show up and stand up, and this is the time. Thank you.
I don't have a clicker. Karen and Mary, thank you. As always, thorough and complete and highly informative. I'm not going to replow the ground that I gave in my own little presentation last time we did this, just to update you a little bit. I met with the fire chief of the town following our last presentation with respect to flow rates. Flow rate is the pressure of the water coming out of the fire hydrant. We talk about replacement of water mains, but the system is bigger than just the mains it's in. It's the ability of the water to get out. This was a concern that we heard expressed by the town of Hull when we went down for a joint meeting a couple of weeks ago. This is the issue. This is a transformative issue for this town, and it's going to mark us as a community as to how we respond to it. I served a number of years on the planning board, so I'm used to advancing proposed changes to the zoning bylaw that typically require a 2/3 vote. But I'll join in my colleagues in saying that the agitating and the propaganda that the water company has advanced in this issue is breathtaking. And last week, when I was preparing myself to knock on doors in the neighborhood, I started thumbing through some of the invoices, and to be honest with you, it was sickening. Because there's a concerted effort reflected in all of these invoices for this corporation to insinuate itself into the community at all levels in an effort to defeat this effort. And, rather than having the upfront face-to-face conversation, we're greeted with the kind of ploys that, the merits somehow get lost in all of this. And, somebody who I respect highly said to me, well, now that you're stepping out of your role as selectman, the filter is off. And I said, well, no, it isn't off. We're responding with dignity, but to say nothing about what they're doing would be a disservice to the community, because the way that it's been done is a sophisticated, deliberate strategy for you to become distracted from the message that we are trying very hard to deliver to you. This is a message that's been tested by experts in the field at all different levels: finance, rate setting, operational. It gave me an extraordinarily good feeling when I heard Andrew Gottlieb talking about the importance of protecting the source supply of our water. Because we as a community have been doing that. And we've been doing that for years, and we've spent millions of dollars to do it. And we've invited the water company to participate, but it's declined to do so. I think it speaks, ladies and gentlemen, to the motives that we as a community have versus the motives that Aquarian has, or Kelda, or Macquarie, or Eversource, whatever you want to call them. They're not aligned at all. So, as we go forward, I'm happy to take any questions. We have a number of very talented people in the audience. I want to thank them again. I did this the last time. To my colleagues in particular, just such a superb job. I can't thank you both enough for the dedication and hard work you've put into this. And Mr. Asher, there's a special place in heaven for you, sir. Mr. Siegfried, there you are. Josh Krumholtz, Joe Beerworth, Bob Higgins. Bob's got 25 years with the water company. He's our chairman of the board sewer commission. You think he doesn't know a thing or two about this place? Randy Sylvester, 19 years on the water company. He's got all the certifications. He could walk in there tomorrow and run it. We're in good shape, people. Don't let these guys scare you. We have this. We would not be pitching this to the town of Hingham now if we weren't fully confident that we have the ability to do it. 96% of the people, 96% of the towns in the Commonwealth are publicly operated and owned. Are you seriously doubting that we have the ability to run a water system? I mean, come on. Has anybody got a question? I know it's nice. It's a nice day out there. Yes, ma'am.
Diane Napper, 16 Gardner Street. Sorry, you knew I was I'll make this quick because it is nice. I totally agree. I think like many, I think almost everyone agrees the PR has been very unfortunate. The one outstanding issue or maybe concern I still have is for the 15 employees who are at the plant. They are people from Hingham. These are our people. And I know they will be, written into an RFP. And I thank Mary for at least addressing it, because it really probably wasn't something I was thinking of a couple months ago. Are there any additional, comforts that can be given to those employees and their families of what will happen when the town buys the water company? Thank you.
So thank you for the question. And just as background, there are approximately 15 people who work right now providing the water that we have. And it's been important to the town as we've looked at this to try to try to capture that expertise, because there's some very hardworking people who do their jobs very well. We just think they don't have enough resources to do it. So a couple steps the town's taken. As we issue a request for proposal, if town meeting were to vote yes and we issue a request for proposal, included in that we will establish as one of the criteria for selection that preference be given to retaining as many of the employees as possible. And, that's something that we can do. And with respect to, is there anything else we can do? I think what we can offer as a town is stability of ownership. As much as it's been unnerving for us that our water system has had 3 different owners, imagine if you're working for that company and you have 3 different companies within a 15 or 17-year period. I've been part of corporations, and I have experienced the uncertainty that comes with transition. So I would say that in addition to that, there is some future stability that the town would offer that, that will hopefully be something that is attractive.
I'd just like to add too that I went to high school with some of those guys, so as I said before the last time when Darren Durth asked that question, this is something that we have continued to state publicly. And I'm just concerned that Aquarian is raising this as a specter unfairly. If we're committing to do this, we're going to do it. We mean what we say, and we say what we mean, in contrast to the company. Is there any other?
I'd like to add one element to that too. I have some experience with outsourcing in a different arena, information technology. And the people that know the system best right now are the people that are working in it. And what I think they also know are all the things that need to be done that haven't been done because they haven't been funded. And so I think that for those folks to look at the prospect of the financials that Mary and Karen have described and know that there's enough money there to do what you know should be done should be a comfort to them and a satisfying thing to contemplate if the town votes affirmatively.
Yes, sir. Paul.
Hi, I'm Paul Dean with the Darrow Management.
Wait for the mic.
I have a comment and a question. The comment is to your question about the position for those employees. If they are represented employees, I'm going to guess that they have a contract, and their contract likely has a successors clause in it. As a former local union president, I know that was a very common thing to go into contracts, at least a couple of decades ago when mergers and takeovers began to happen. The local unions were nervous that their present agreements could go by the wayside with the new owners, and successor clauses went in. So I have no idea, number one, if they're organized, and if they are, or if they do, whether their contract has a successor clause, but I would venture to bet that they probably do. The second question I have, or comment, is, Mary, did I hear you say that they spent money on opposition research on the light plant or light plant employees, or both?
So, Paul, and that's a public record at the DPU file room, but one of the invoices says HMLP opposition research. There's no description there. Again, it's a public record that people can look at. It would not be appropriate for me to do anything other than repeat the words that are on the
No,
document.
I couldn't see it. I thought that you said employees, which I found even more distressing.
If I did, I should have just read HMLP opposition research, so.
Okay.
And meanwhile, they probably found none because I think it's safe to say that the town is very satisfied with the operation you and your employees run.
Well, thank you. There was that time in the 7th grade, though.
Yes, sir. Gentleman in the rust-colored jacket with his hand up in the middle, in front of Kirk.
Hi, Brad Carr on Tupelo Drive. You mentioned there was in the town's plan 2.7 million, I think, annual capital investment. I'm just curious how that relates to what Aquarian is doing and how you anticipate that changing or impacting the linear feet of main replacement and the water loss kind of metrics you had up there.
Question. John, you want to?
Okay, I'll take a cut at it, and Ed can chime in if I miss something. First part of my response would be that the models of both the town and Aquarian that the town's expert basically evaluated, which are on our website, use the same capital expenditure over the course of 31 years. That was driven from the Aquarian's 5-year capital plan presentation in August of 2018. It starts at $2.7 million in year one and is escalated after about 5 or 6 years by 5%, the town's model, by 5% to accommodate the effects of inflation, and the interest borrowing rate by 25 basis points, 1/4%, every 3 years. So by 2049, what was $2.7 million in 2019 is about $3.8 million. In aggregate, the total capital expenditure by the town would be about $94 million. And relative to the chart that Mary presented about linear feet, by my calculation, that would exceed the 1% threshold, about 10,000 linear feet per year, if it were maintained over the course of 100 years. Say, that answer your question? That's what the Tata and Howard study recommended to Aquarian. They say about 1%, so that in 100 years, you'd basically replace the whole system. As Mary said, the average age of the mains in our system now, Service Area A, Hingham, Hull, North Cohasset, is 64 years. There are about 13% of the mains that are over 100 years old, and the expected useful life is 70 years. So there's work to do.
I would also just add that, and again, some of this, it's a little bit difficult to see, but I think there's a difference between saying how much you are going to invest in capital and how much you invest in capital. And so, for example, in the rate case in 2012, Aquarian said, we're gonna put this much into capital, and we're gonna do these water mains, and we're gonna do all this stuff. And a lot of that work didn't get done. So in some ways, we're comparing what someone is saying they are going to spend. What I think is happening here is that when there are excessive water main breaks, which require emergency repairs that often cost more money, that some of the money that would otherwise be spent on capital to fix the main, that money is having to be used for these emergency water repairs that are, putting a Band-Aid on something. So again, it's unlike in Hingham, where you open up this warrant and you will see how every dollar is spent in both operating money and in capital. We don't have that same line of sight to how our ratepayer dollars are being spent. But as John said, if you look at the actual water main replacement data and you apply the cost per foot that Aquarian gives, we believe that the money under town ownership will be greater capital investment consistently every year for 30 years.
And I'd add one more point. In the rate case that Aquarian filed that was just ruled by the Department of Public Utilities on 31 October, Aquarian said that it could not increase its capital investment without approval of an annual capital surcharge that's over and above the rate increase that the DPU approved that's now hitting all our bills. And that capital surcharge will start hitting our bills every year this September and every September thereafter. Without that, Aquarian says we can't accelerate capital investment, which is roughly about equal to their depreciation cost, around $2 million, a little more, for the entire Aquarian of Massachusetts operation, not just Service Area A. So when we're talking $2.7 million in Service Area A, right away, we're spending more money on our system than Aquarian is typically spending in all of Massachusetts, both Service Area A and B.
I think it's also important to appreciate the fact that the work that we would do would be in alignment with our ongoing road work. And, that kind of efficiency is just, it's a natural savings to us as citizens. Yes, sir.
Ben Matthews, 1 Sarah Way. You mentioned that Aquarian's treatment plant is owned by a separate company from Aquarian in general. Does the $108 million acquisition fee include the treatment plant?
It does, and actually that's one of the reasons that we had to have litigation, because when Aquarian first told us that the water company would cost $192 million, they maintained that it didn't include the water treatment plant. So when the town engaged in litigation, we had to do two things. We had to get the court's ruling on whether the water treatment plant was part of the purchase, and then the purchase price formula. So the $108 million purchase price is all the assets. It's the water treatment plant, it's the system, it's the trucks, it's the software, it's everything. As our lawyer says, you get it all.
Okay, one other question. I'm not really familiar with how an enterprise fund works, but would the bond issue be a revenue bond or a general obligation bond?
Thank you for that question. When we looked at financing the debt on the purchase, we looked at different types of instruments, and we got some guidance from our financial advisors. We looked at primarily a general obligation bond versus a revenue bond. And just kind of briefly, a general obligation bond is how we finance most of the things like this beautiful school that we're sitting in. That's a general obligation bond, and the town's AAA bond rating affords us some of the lowest rates available to municipalities. A revenue bond is an alternative method of financing that essentially what you do is you pledge the revenue of the enterprise against you pledge that's how you're going to pay for it. And we learned a couple important things which led to our recommendation that we do general obligation bond financing. First of all, the difference between the revenue bond financing rate that we would get, there is a difference in rates. General obligation financing is lower, but more importantly, general obligation bond financing, we can actually finance it with the bond rating of the town behind us, that AAA rating. So if we were to go out for a revenue bond, the Hingham Water Company would be a new entity. And so the rating agencies would not just look and say, revenue bonds are typically a little higher rate, but they'd say, gosh, there's no history here. So the rates would be even higher. As we're looking at this, as Karen said, we were all about the ratepayers. How do we make sure that not just the purchase, but the future capital needs are the lowest cost to the ratepayers? So that's why we're proposing general obligation funding. I just make one last point because a very important question has come up on that, which is, does general obligation funding at all create some exposure for us as Hingham taxpayers? And we thought about that and we looked at that. And the answer is that, general obligation bonds, the town would need to step in if the enterprise fund could not pay its bills. The town would have to step in. So we actually took a step in establishing the year one enterprise fund budget to mitigate the possibility of that happening. And the step that we took was we decided that in this first year of financing, we're going to keep water rates the same. And so if you look in your warrant, when you get it, you'll see the enterprise fund budget. It's a $13 million. So our water rates will stay the same. The town will collect $13 million. Our costs in year one to operate the water company are actually about $8.8 million. I'm sorry, $8.2 million. We will have in year one a $4.8 million surplus that we've budgeted in a line item in that enterprise fund. And it has to stay in the enterprise fund. And our thought is that creates some liquidity and some financial liquidity that will remain in the enterprise fund, so that in the very unlikely event that there would be a revenue deficit at the end, a retained earnings deficit at the end of the year, we wouldn't have to lean into the town for that money. It's kind of like what, in Hingham, in our operating budget, we have our rainy day fund that we call fund balance. And that's equivalent to like 20% of what we collect from everybody, 20% of our budget. The $4.8 million surplus that we're keeping within the enterprise fund represents about 37% of the annual cost to operate the system. So we thought that would be an appropriate measure that would provide some assurance that although we would be financing this with general obligation funding, we would be able to create some separation with the enterprise fund and with the town. So that's kind of the last piece of it.
And not to keep you in here longer than you want to be, but I guess there are a couple other points. So as Mary said, because the bonds are financed as general obligation bonds, if there were to be, a catastrophic financial event that hit the water system, that ate through almost $5 million of retained earnings, the town would step in the short term and advance money to the enterprise fund to cover that obligation. But then the ratepayers would end up picking up that obligation. So it'd be a loan from the town to the enterprise fund, and then it would become the ratepayers' responsibility, which it would be the ratepayers' responsibility under any form of ownership. That's who pays the bills for this, right? No one's coming in on their white horse with a bag of cash to take care of this stuff. If something happens to the system, that obligation belongs to us today under for-profit ownership, and it would belong to us as ratepayers tomorrow. I think it's important to understand, though, that enterprise fund system does provide a level of protection for the town, because it provides an accounting tool to be able to segregate the assets, but also segregate the liabilities. And if the town, again, needs to advance cash to the enterprise fund, we can do that, but we will also be paid back for that. The other thing I think is just really, really important that everybody understand, because I've heard it, I've heard it constantly. The acquisition of the water company has nothing to do with any other capital priority in the town of Hingham, period. So this in no way interferes with our ability to move forward and consider other capital projects like Foster School or a new fire station or, fixes to our town hall campus. That's a completely different conversation. So I would really appreciate it if you leave here today, and if anyone brings that up, make sure you're clear. That's just not the case. That's part of the disinformation, I think, that's out there. So the general obligation bonds do not interfere with the town's borrowing more generally with respect to municipal capital priorities.
I'll add one more point to your question about risk. The model that Ed Siegfried built, that we worked on together, and that was subsequently validated by Anderson tax valuation expert, as you saw Mary present, contemplates at least $48 million of savings over the 31 years associated with acquisition and repayment of that debt. The borrowing rate that was left in by Anderson tax that Ed and I baked into the model 7 years ago, in consultation with the town's financial advisors, capital market advisors, with whom we've been corresponding pretty frequently, is currently 3.75%. If we were to go to market today, the actual rate would be 2.65%. And the effect of that is to take $48 million and add another 21. So now you're sitting right around $70 million, 69 to $70 million of savings, again, absent the annual capital surcharge that Aquarian will start applying. So that we don't even take that into account in terms of the difference in cost between continued Aquarian ownership and town ownership.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm June Friedman in 13 Autumn Circle. I have a rather nitty-gritty question. I was always puzzled that we would have a very wet winter and a very wet spring, and we still would have water restrictions as early as April or May and all through the summer. And when I inquired, I was told it wasn't the amount of water, it was the ability to pump it out. So I'm wondering if we can do better. Would that also include summer availability for our outdoor flower and vegetable gardens?
Thank you for the question. So I'll start out. There are a couple of things that are influencing those irrigation, the irrigation signs are already up. The first one is that the Department of Environmental Protection limits the amount of water that can be withdrawn from the aquifer. That's set by the state, and there are very steep penalties because the state is very much about conservation. And when our watershed was declared stressed, that puts some additional visibility on it. So we as a community can withdraw. It's 1.2 billion gallons across the year. And it's about 3.5 million gallons a day, and it's less in the winter and more in the summer, but you have to balance that. There are a couple of things going on. First of all, the unaccounted for water that we talked about, where, you know, in 2012, 24% of the water that was being withdrawn was not available to us. Certainly that's why we think that accelerated capital investment is so important, because that's water that could be available for consumption or that we wouldn't have to withdraw from the aquifer. So, you know, that's going to be a continued effort. The role of the water commissioners is going to be working alongside with our water supply committee to look at all of the issues related to how we use our water, how we conserve our water, you know, watering restrictions. We do have that state limit that we have to be mindful of, but I would also add that as we think about perhaps asking the state if we'd want to increase that withdrawal limit for some reason, you know, one of the things that they look at pretty carefully is, well, how are you using the resource you have? And our unaccounted for water has improved over the last 7 years. The last reported amount is 16%. But, you know, we've been told that unaccounted for water levels still of 16. The DEP is, you know, if we petition for that, they'd say, listen, you don't have a water supply issue, you have a water management issue. It's how you're using it. So again, the importance of that capital investment is pretty significant. And we have to balance the conservation versus consumption.
I wonder if it makes sense to ask Mr. Gottlieb to perhaps respond to that question as well.
Thanks. Actually, Selectman Power answered it pretty well, so I don't have that much to add. Other than the fact, you know, part of my background is I used to manage that program. You'll actually probably find my signature on your Water Management Act registration, 1986. The question is really dead on. You know, there are state standards of 10% unaccounted for water, and so to the extent to which you were seeking permission to obtain additional withdrawal authority, you'd have to meet that 10% either as a precondition to getting the water or as a permit condition going forward. And I think it's instructive to look at the history of water use in Massachusetts in general. The reason that the Water Management Act was passed in 1986 was because of a drought and perceived shortage. And what was really found out to be the case is that, as the Selectman said, it was not so much a withdrawal problem as it was a poor use of the resource problem. And Massachusetts Water Resource Authority is a great example. They were taking 336 million gallons a day in 1985 to 1986, said they needed another 100 million gallons a day. And the environmental community and the state regulators said, no, you don't actually need that if you get serious about maintaining your system in a way that's up to standard. 25, 30 years later, much more development in the metropolitan Boston system. That same system serving a larger base is now using about 200 million gallons a day. Wow. And the benefit to the town owning the system and operating it is to provide the environmental stewardship necessary to realize that there's more than just the cost effectiveness from an investor return perspective in deciding how many leaks you're going to fix when you actually have an interest in maintaining the quality of the resource for public purposes beyond just water supply. And because the town has an interest in the stewardship of the resource, the calculus on determining which leaks you go after is not just an investment return question. It's really what's in the best interest of the broader community. And so I think that, you know, year one, you're not going to be able to turn the switch and have a significant improvement in that, but the capital replacement program that you're looking at and that you've heard described to you will put those building blocks in place to ensure that a far greater percentage of the water that you're pumping and removing from the system gets to your community That'll bring down the amount you need to pump. It'll change the conversation from we need an authorization from the state to get more water to have we utilized the water that we're taking as effectively as we can. There's a rate benefit to you in addition to that. You're pumping water, you're treating water, you're not receiving revenue for it because it's not hitting anybody's meter and you're not being billed, nobody's paying for that water. So you're incurring an expense for which there is no economic return. In addition, getting more water is an expensive undertaking. There's regulatory costs associated with it, there's system development costs, there's expansion of pipes and pumps and all that come from it. So it is far cheaper and better for you as a system to drive down your unaccounted for water, not just to the state minimum. And remember, minimum is like a participation medal. You get to 10%, that's great. But you can do better than that, and there are systems that are doing better than that. So I think there's the plans that I've heard the town speak to provide a lot of hope that over the long term, some of those summer water restrictions that you're concerned with will be a thing of the past.
Thank you, Mr. Gottlieb. Mr. Heidel.
Thank you. I'm Bob Heidel, Guilford Road, Hingham. I'd like to add a little perspective to your answer. I happen to be a hydrogeologist. I'm allowed out in public on Saturday afternoons. The other thing that we have to be very sensitive to in the town of Hingham is our recharge areas. We have a sole source aquifer, and what that means technically is that more than 50% of the town's water comes from a single aquifer. And one of the things that Aquarian was unwilling to do over time, and I think probably their predecessor would be thrown into this basket, and probably their predecessor would have been thrown into it, is to acquire and protect land within our critical recharge areas. And recently, you probably know that the town purchased the Laner property. I would say that we paid a premium for that property. We paid $5 million, which is a lot of money. But that's one of the most critical properties this town's ever bought, because it sits over the recharge area from which the water is drawn to distribute through our town. And I think we need to face some issues in this town with relevance to our development programs in terms of real estate development. When it rains or when it snows, this is called recharge precipitation. Every road we built that has a drainage system on it, in large part, depending on where you are in town, gets shunted out to sea and doesn't get into our recharge. Those subdivisions that dump into a wetland, generally it gets into our recharge system. So I think it's very important, coupled with the 10%, the whole concept of DEP management, this too has to play a role. We have to get as much recharge, and in climate change, this is going to be a challenge. So again, Aquarian's that's not their interest. Their interest is not the recharge. Their interest is to sell water. And I did hear a rumor, and I'm not sure whether Mary said DEP owns the water. I have a hearing aid, so sometimes I miss what people say. If I had it out, I probably could have heard you.
Controls the water
The DEP controls the water supply in Massachusetts, is what I
Okay,
what
all
I
right.
said.
Because there's a rumor that somebody brought to me that says DEP owns the water, so why should we, all we're doing is buying the piping system. Well, that would almost take a constitutional change to achieve that kind of ownership. In the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, we operate under what is known as the riparian rights. Once you get past the Mississippi Valley, you're into prior appropriation, a much more difficult ownership of water resources. I'm a courts expert on water rights. So I spend a lot of my time testifying all over the world, actually, on who actually had the rights to the water. If you own a piece of land, the laners, let's say the town owns the laner property. Every ounce of water under that property is owned by us. The only thing that DEP does is regulates how much we can extract as a public water supply out of the aquifer. And in many cases, that's actually a negotiated number. There's science behind it, there's economics behind it, and sometimes the science doesn't work in favor of what the ideal would be, and yet you can't starve a town of water. So you have a negotiated withdrawal. This town has exceeded its allotment probably for the last 10 years on a fairly regular basis. Why? Partly because of leaks and partly because of the significant increase of development we have had in this town. So we have to be very careful when we address this. And I have only one more comment and I'll leave. And that is, this town's 400 years old. And here we are in a great school. We have a great police department, great fire department, school department, great administrators. How did we get here? 400 years later, how did we get here? Because this town made right legacy decisions. And those are the decisions that underpin how a municipality operates. And I consider the acquisition of this water company one of those legacy decisions that provides for generations. So we need to do this. And if you're listening on TV, we need to do this. Thank you all.
Yes, sir.
Just a point of clarification.
Wait for the mic.
Just a point of clarification on the
Identify yourself by name and address, please.
Okay, Brian Stack, 654 Main Street. I'd just like a point of clarification on the unallocated water. The number that's gone around for a long time, I think, was 25%. You mentioned something about 16%. So I guess my question is, what's the real opportunity for efficiency relative to the standard? And then I guess perhaps a question from Mr. Gottlieb. That's the quote-unquote standard, but what would be the, under best practices, let's say, the attainable opportunity to eliminate or, significantly diminish the unallocated water if you looked at the better performing municipal water plants?
Do you want to take that again?
I think Andrew's.
Wait for the mic.
The current performance at 16% is right about average. And, the expectation under regulatory standard is that a well-run system, a reasonably tight system, should be no greater than 10%. And there are a number of systems out there that do meet or exceed meaning below 10, that performance standard. We are, generally speaking, an old state with a lot of old infrastructure. And so the newer systems tend to perform better. It's not just leaks in unaccounted for water. Unaccounted for water is a function of leakage in the system, the distribution system, before it gets from the pumping location to the customers, and also meter under registration. So if you've got an old set of meters that are not up to standard, they don't spin the right way, and you're not billing for all the water that's being achieved by your customers. So it's a combination of the two things. The older the system, though, typically driven by leakage. So, achieving 10% is easily, not easily, but it's a readily and realistically achievable guideline. 25% was the historic reported
2012.
unaccounted for water. Under the registration process, under Massachusetts law, the water company, like anyone else, is granted the state's permission to withdraw a certain quantity of water. Water is publicly owned, public resource in Massachusetts, and your ability to withdraw the water that either flows by your property or underneath your property is conditioned upon that registration and permitting statute. It requires an annual reporting of each withdrawer, how much they're taking from their sources, and then how much is actually being sold to customers. And that's the derivation annually of that unaccounted for water number. So there's a pretty good data set across the state, who's doing what and what the trends are. And you saw, meaningful improvement in your water system over the last couple of years from a period when it was actually pretty poorly performing.
Can I jump in with maybe an anecdote? Because I think you raised a good question. Like, there's been a decrease in unaccounted for water. Do we have an opportunity to do better? And I would say yes. And I would base that on John's nodding. We, in the fall, part of what we did was we went out and talked to other superintendents of other water systems and other municipalities to get our arms around, how the systems work and what are the best practices that are out there. And the DEP actually recommended that we talk to a guy in Hyannis, who's the water superintendent there, Hans Kaiser. And they pointed to Mr. Kaiser's leadership and Hyannis's leadership in the investment in their water system as being a pathway that represented best practices in the Commonwealth. So we took a ride down there, and Hyannis bought their water system back from a for-profit company pursuant to a similar special act in 2005. The folks, Mr. Kaiser in particular, was saying best thing the town ever did, because as Mr. Gottlieb's saying, it allowed the town to coordinate a whole host of things around the acquisition of its water resource. And so they did exactly what we're planning to do, which is to take the savings that are generated between the operating costs of a municipality and the operating costs of a for-profit system, and actually take that cash and put it into infrastructure improvement. And so beginning in 2005, that's what they did. And they started out with a 16% unaccounted for water rate, and they're down to 6%. So I would say, and it's a smaller system for sure, but it had, as Mr. Gottlieb points out, the similar age in pipes. And so we walked out of there feeling like our plans for this system were validated by the results in Hyannis. And so I have every confidence that if we do what we plan to do, which is the methodical improvement of the system over time, as Andy said, we're not going to be able to flip a switch, but we will be able to march down the road toward a tighter, more efficient system, which, as you were discussing earlier, takes better care of our water resource and our watershed, and is better overall for every single ratepayer in the system.
The other thing that also happens that we learned in talking with Hans Kaiser is that when you put the money in and start reducing unaccounted for water, you also start reducing your operations and maintenance costs, so that over the long haul you get benefits both ways, both in terms of repair as well as what it costs to actually run it day to day.
Mr. Chambers. We go around the room once, and then we circle back if anybody wants a second go.
Thank you.
It's the basic rule.
My name is Al Chambers. I live at the Lincoln School downtown. I've been a long-term resident of the town, but I'm not a native. Growing up here in Hingham in the early 50s, it was a town of 7,000. It was a real country town. And we were still getting over the fact that most of South Hingham was Italian prisoner of war camps and army camps and things like that. And I grew up on Forest Lane, which was a parade ground off Prospect Street. Today, Hingham is a town that's worth $7 billion. That's the actual value of your property and improvements and all that. It's a remarkable figure, being shared by 23,000 people. one of the best assets we have in terms of value doesn't show at all. And that's the harbor. We've got beautiful waterfront, we've got beautiful views of Mass Bay, and it's what towns like Wellesley and Needham and Sudbury don't have. We've got a lot of extra assets. I was initially very skeptical of this purchase, and my reasoning was very simple indeed. My reasoning was, why should we spend $108 million to buy something we already have? But I went to all the meetings. I mean to tell you, I went to every meeting I could go to. And I did listen carefully, and not being as bright as many of the people we have around here, I had to. And eventually, step by step, it fell into place that this would be a terrible mistake for this town in this year of 2019, worth $7 million, to pass up the chance to own this resource and control it. And I realized there were some drawbacks to that. It's not completely true, but a lot of it's true. When I went to the last forum, and the last forum positively convinced me, after listening to everyone go through the room, and every person that I heard, and I sincerely mean this, we have very, very bright people and very accomplished people, and they're everywhere. We're so lucky that this town drafts these people, and they work for the most part on a voluntary basis. Getting to the end of the meeting, there were two speakers that positively had me in their control. One is Bob Hilliard, and the other was Charlie Berry, who, of course, successfully completed the purchase of the land off Pleasant Street. I was convinced from that moment that we should buy this water company. So my message to you is, I've got a meeting to go to. Buy the water company. Period. You're doing the right thing. And
Thank you.
thank you for making this possible.
Thank you.
Thank you, Al. Appreciate your transformation. Is there anybody else who'd like to say anything before we conclude? All right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for coming out. This is a beautiful day.
Thank you.
Appreciate you hearing the message. Really ask you to tell your friends, encourage them to come to town meeting. This is a 2/3 vote. It's 66 plus 1. So
Be the +1.
we'll continue to meet with
Bring a +1.
different groups around town, but if you have any interest in a sign on your lawn to speak to your position to your friends and neighbors, that can be available as well. So thank you, and good night.
Thank you, everybody.